This is a Momentum Media production.
The SMSF Advisor Show. Your expert insights into the biggest themes shaping the SMSF advice industry.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the SMSF Advisor Show. I'm joined by my co-host, Aaron Dunn, CEO of Smarter SMSF. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, Miranda. How are you?
I'm good. Finally out of 3 weeks of isolation. So
I've done my period of ISO as well. So we do live both in New South Wales and Victoria. So the chances of picking up COVID and then running rampant through the house was pretty high on the agenda, I would have thought. So, but I must admit, I feel luckily I didn't get any major problems. I had my booster about a week before, so that certainly helped. But if I was to get it, I wanted to get it when I did get it because obviously there are a range of events and things that are coming up now that obviously I'd be a lot more probably schizophrenic about a little bit about, am I going to get this or am I not going to get it? And so now that I've had it, I'm just like, I don't have the word bulletproof's right, but I feel a lot different now that I've gone through it and triple vaxxed and all that sort of stuff. So I'm looking forward to getting on a few airplanes over the next few months anyway.
yeah, it's probably better to get it out of the way now. So.
Yeah, so we have a fantastic SMSF Advisor show lined up today, and we'll talk about that shortly, where we are looking obviously at the quality of advice. And we've got, for the first time, I think, a multitude of speakers, not just one, but it'll look like a bit of the Brady Bunch if we look at it on a Zoom screen as we record our SMSF Advisor show. But before we do that, Miranda, let's go through what's making news, both from a technical perspective and also through the SMSF Advisor website.
So we've actually got the Treasury Laws Amendment Enhancing Superannuation Outcomes Bill planned for debate in the House of Representatives and also the Senate this week, which is interesting. It looks like the government might be trying to push through those measures.
Yeah, so this was pleasing to see. It's probably the best thing I can make here. So obviously looking this up, we could see that it does appear high on the agenda for the House of Representatives. And interestingly, just to have a bit of a peek forward on the Senate's agenda, obviously Parliament has reconvened this week, and there are only a limited number of sitting days between now, federal budget, and potentially the election being called. So this was a great sight to see, where this Treasury Laws bill that is covering a number of those announcements that were in last year's federal budget. So we are talking about the removal of the work test for voluntary contributions. We're looking at the removal of the 450 SG threshold. We're looking at the downsizer contribution rules and so forth. Unfortunately, they didn't include those SMSF measures around residency and the legacy pension conversions. But if we could get those through and ready to go for 1 July 2022, that would be a fantastic outcome and some certainty for advisors in putting together their advice, obviously, in this back half of the financial year.
And who knows, if they get this set through quickly, they might be able to focus on those other measures that weren't included in the bill.
Absolutely.
We've also seen the ATO provide a few more details on SuperStream. There was quite a few new developments in the latest round of guidance they released to do with family law splits, also overseas rollovers from foreign funds, and also contribution splitting as well.
Yeah, so this is obviously just part of the ongoing challenges, I'll call it, with SuperStream. We have our new requirements since late last year where funds need to comply with that, in essence, 3-day time frame around the transfers between super funds, whether it's SMSF to SMSF or SMSF and APRA regulated funds. And really what this updated guidance is referencing is the fact that there are circumstances whereby the requirements to meet that 3-day time frame just going to be impractical just by virtue of the scenario that we've got involved. So if it's a family law requirement, then it's going to be very difficult to satisfy that 3-day time frame because we're going to have court orders and the like as well. So ultimately, we've got some updated guidance that deals specifically with some of those issues.
We've also seen, with the budget coming up, some submissions start to come through, including the one from the SMSF Association, which is listed a range of different areas that they're lobbying for, including a more practical approach to non-geared unit trust breaches.
Yeah, so this is something that does make a lot of sense. And we saw through COVID the ATO provide relief around this very issue. So where we have an arrangement with a non-geared trust, and ultimately there was a loan that was provided, which is obviously one of the breaches in SIS regulation 13.22D. What the ATO it said in that regard from that legislative instrument is that there will be a level of relief insofar that that won't count towards the 5% threshold. Now, when there are other circumstances where we have a FO, that 13.22D, there really is no other option except what I call the nuclear button. So you literally blow up that arrangement. And it's gone to show that there is an opportunity here to find some middle ground. And maybe that's through commissioner discretion or whatever the case may be. But it did form one of the pillars of the SMSF Association's submission recommendations for the government to consider, amongst other things, their recommitment, obviously, at this stage to the residency and legacy pension reforms that they've announced, trying to simplify the transfer balance cap. We've got so many different tiers for total superannuation balance purposes and so forth. Things like removing cancellation fees for SMSF auditors, some further clarification around design and distribution obligations and TMDs. And finally, I think the other one was around protecting the unused concessional contributions where you've got prior year SG amounts that have been paid late so they don't get caught up at that point in time. So there's still plenty that the association sees as being important to further improve the way and operation and regulation of the SMSF industry.
On the business side of things, we've also seen the Hub24 acquisition of Class get approved by the New South Wales Supreme Court, I think it is, Yep. So obviously that's moving along as well.
Yeah, so this was quite a large announcement we saw late last year, where there'd obviously been a decision and ultimately approval of shareholders to go through that process for Hub24 to look to acquire under a scheme of arrangement where Hub is ultimately going to acquire all the shares in Class. So that did need to, as you said, Miranda, get approval by the Supreme Court in New South Wales, which has now happened. I believe as of this week, the shares in Class have obviously been suspended now and will obviously move over into Hub24 under the terms of that scheme. And we will see Andrew Russell as part of the announcements of this being going through. Once we've gone through that period of transition, he will ultimately leave Class in that CEO role. And obviously that will then form part of the broader scope of what will fit under Hub24's executive mandate.
Well, we've also seen budget submissions. We've also seen a bit of lobbying on other fronts, such as the advisor education reforms, which brings us to our next segment, which is going to be focused on the quality of advice review, which is coming up to be released at the end of this year. So we've got a number of experts speaking today, including Bronny Speed, who is the financial advice leader at Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand, Tracey Scotchbrook, policy manager at the SMSF Association, Bryan Ashenden, head of financial literacy and advocacy, BT Financial Group. And we've also got Michael Davison, senior manager, advocacy and retirement policy from CPA Australia. So we've got quite a lot of speakers, so it'll be a bit of a panel style session. So the government's quality of financial advice review is going to examine the legislative framework around financial advice, and it's going to be looking at a broad range of issues that this could have, and obviously that's going to have some significant implications for not just advisors, but for super and SMSF advice specifically as well. A large part of this review is focused on making advice more accessible and affordable, with some of the regulatory compliance at the moment creating higher costs. So we're going to look at some of the problem areas in this kind of space and perhaps some of the regulation that government should be focusing on. I thought we could first start with you, Bronny, and what you kind of would like to see tackled in this review from a chartered accountant's point of view.
Thank you, Miranda. Hello, everyone. This is a big area. There are lots of moving parts to the industry. And I just think it's been pretty clear that the FCA reforms and then the Hayne reforms have actually seen advice become more expensive, not less expensive. There seems to be more regulation than less regulation. Due to FCA, we've got less advisors, but more people after COVID need advice. So it would be nice to be able to come to a level playing field that actually supports consumers. We really must focus on advice becoming affordable for consumers because they really need advice.
And Michael, is that sort of your focus in terms of for accountants as well?
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. And just to back up what Bronny said, I mean, absolutely, the core of this review has to be, the review has to be consumer-centric. I mean, we've seen a raft of regulation over the years. We have regulation upon regulation. We have reform. It's already on putting more rules in place and more regulation in place. It's now at the point where it's choking the industry. We need to go back to the start and look at how it actually impacts the consumer. What are the consumer's needs? What do they want? How do we engage with the consumer?
Tracey, you obviously represent both advisors and accountants. What are some of the things that you'd like to see tackled in this review, particularly focusing on SMSF advice?
Yeah, look, I echo the comments of Bronny and Michael, and just to add to that the layers of complexity really are a pain point, and other issues that flow from that too is the fact that the FASIA reforms and the way the legislation is structured really is focused on someone who's a comprehensive or a full service financial advisor. There's no real contemplation of the different types of advice services and advisors that are out there in the marketplace. So this is a really great opportunity to really, I think, drill down into this and get these different advice services clearly defined and how advice can be delivered really closely examined so we can get that consumer-centric, cost-effective, functional model in place.
And from the advisor kind of side of things, what are some things that you would like to see focused on in the review, Bryan?
Thanks, Miranda. And again, I'd agree with the comments that everyone else has made that you want to see that this is very client focused, and I think unfortunately what we've just seen over many years, successive governments and so on, is that there's been a lot of reaction to where things have happened. So how do we address that particular issue that has come up? And I think what we're hoping that this review will do is take that much more holistic approach and say, well, at the end of the day, what is it that we want the end consumer to do? Number one, that is get advice that's going to help them. So what's the right system that we can have in place that enables that to happen? So clearly, I think if we can focus on how do we simplify the requirements, how do we have a system in place that says, if I've got a client that only needs, single topic advice, relatively simple advice, we can deliver that in an easy manner. And you can actually see that there's a big difference in terms of the amount of time that is required, the amount of effort that's required to produce that piece of advice compared to something that is much more comprehensive. And I think that's where we see some of the struggles today, is it's almost, whether it's a simple piece of advice or a more complex piece of advice, the time difference is not dramatically different. So it can take a long time to get that simple piece of advice because of the various, there are regulatory obligations, there are, regulatory hurdles and so on. But it's also, I think there's an element in here about getting not only advisors and their clients comfortable, but also getting the licensees and the regulators comfortable that we can take a different approach where we don't have to disclose everything to the client, that, everybody gets on the same page. And I think that's ultimately we want to see, is not just, well, this sounds good if you do it this way, but let's all get behind it and make sure it can actually be delivered on. That's going to be the sign of success.
Bryan makes a really good point. It is that relationship between the licensee and the advisor. We're going down this path of greater individual responsibility on the advisor with advisor registration, etc., and what was the FCA regime. What is that interaction between the roles and responsibilities of the licensee versus the roles and responsibilities of the advisor? How do we get that right? Because there is definitely conflict there. We're all seeing it. We're hearing it from our members all the time. How do we address that?
And to back you all up on that as well, we could have a discussion amongst ourselves as to what's general advice, what's scaled advice, what's personal advice, what's wholesale advice, what's retail advice, what's product advice, what's this, what's that. And if we're going to have some discussions amongst ourselves that may differ, how on earth can the consumer understand the fact that the regulatory environment in which we sit has so many different rules depending on what type of advice you give? So back to your point, Bryan, let's get onto a level playing field. Let's work in an industry where we're, as Michael said, individual professionals responsible for our own activities, our own compliance, our own CPD, our own quality of advice. And I think this enables us to come up with a blank piece of paper that says, righto, consumer first, how do we all, as differing professionals within an industry, provide advice that's appropriate to a client, that doesn't have to have 78 pages for one super contribution. And, let's get this a little bit more tailored like other professions are.
Very much so. So it's a pretty easy topic, isn't it, when you think about it?
and we've got to the end of December to get it sorted.
Yeah, correct. So maybe drilling down on just one of those pieces of advice there, Bryan, to you, because you've obviously done a lot of discussion and I've heard you speak quite often on the role of scaled advice. And we saw ASIC obviously release a consultation paper last year as well. What are you seeing as the key challenges for advisors providing this type of advice at the moment? And then how can we look to potentially make this easier moving through this process going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Look, I think it's always interesting when you talk about this topic of scaled advice, and some of it has been the question of do the regulators encourage it? Were people scared by standard 6 under the Code of Ethics think about the other things, and even the 7th step under the safe harbour steps? Have you thought about anything else that any other reasonable person would have done? And and therefore, do I have to include everything? And I think we've heard enough comments from our regulators and so on, that's not what was intended. It's really just about making sure you've thought about the consequences, but it doesn't mean you have to advise on everything. Now, that's, it's a mindset that I think everyone needs to get into, that number one, it is possible to do. And, realistically, in a sense, almost every piece of advice that is provided is scaled. It's just to what extent is it scaled, because it really doesn't cover everything. So we should know it can be done, and it can be done well. But I think the starting point for me, again, is always we've got to get people comfortable to know that they can do it. So from an advisor perspective, it's a comfort knowing I can address this particular topic and I have thought about some of those flow-on consequences. So I always think the easy example is talking about holding insurance through super. And yes, I've thought about the erosion of a super balance, whether I address it specifically in this piece of advice or whether I'm calling it out to the client that we must address it separately, but I am raising that topic and I'm taking appropriate action about it. And doing that in a way that says, I've got comfort that the advice I'm delivering to my client can stand up, and people, others aren't going to come in and scrutinise it and say, but you didn't go far enough, you didn't think about all these other things. And again, that is about, for me, that's advisors working with their licensees. It's working with the compliance areas within the licensees, the regulators. And again, just getting that agreement, we know it can be done, and let's work together and make it happen. Because it's not something that I think anyone can do standalone and have that absolute comfort. And that's what you want to have. It's always that, but is something going to go wrong? And how do I make sure I've covered myself that, in the event of someone raising a question, no, clearly I've addressed it and here it is. And the unfortunate thing is it's going to take time, but we need to address it as quickly as possible, because that's how we're going to start to engage, further generations of potential clients to start seeking advice.
Yep. Michael, you want to add something there?
I think just Bryan has made a point there about covering myself. And I think that's what came out really strongly in ASIC's advice review last year. Was a lot of the feedback was, I'm not sure how this fits in with best interest. I'm not sure how this fits in with the CA Code of Ethics. when I'm providing advice to a client, how much I've got to provide them? Do I have to do everything? And importantly, how does this fit in with my licensee's expectations and the compliance department's expectations? That was always a really big thing. Someone's somewhere's always covering themselves, and how can we? And that compliance mindset is driven by the regulatory regime, what comes out of ASIC.
Mm. And it's also backed up by the fact that we've got such massively comprehensive statements of advice. The fee disclosure statements now that have come in are taking an eternity. The amount of time that's required to explain them to a client, they're more complex in what we've got to tell them than the actual purpose of the document itself. So we've got cost of client documents, we've got costs and compliance of being on the advice register ourselves, like Tracey and I, with registrations and overlapping CPD and repetition of study requirements. And we've got cost of business of levies and of PI insurance and compensation schemes. And then we've got dealer group costs, where dealer groups and AFSLs have their own interpretation in many cases. That once again would differ if we all sat down and asked, what does that mean? So all of these layers, we've just got to work through some of these and think about what does the client need and what does the client want, and how can we do this in an appropriate, professional, affordable manner.
We've all kind of touched on that issue around the cost of compliance for those simpler sort of single issue pieces of advice. What kind of things do you hope the review looks at in terms of looking at that recommendation 7.2 from that Tax Practitioners Board review? Is there anything specific that you're hoping might come out of examining that with the review? Might start with you, Bronny.
I think it's reasonably well known off the back of CP 332 that we feel quite strongly that some of the activities that currently fall under an AFSL should in fact fall under tax agent registration. So therefore we would like to see some functions that a qualified accountant who has a certificate of public practice, so therefore the consumer is protected and is a registered tax agent, can actually deliver some services that are in the ordinary course of being an accountant. And I think we need to get back to a few basics that accountants can do in their court training. We do 4-year degrees, we do 3-year postgrads to become chartered accountants. And then in the ordinary course of providing a tax service, we're not allowed to mention off the back of a $60,000 profit how $40,000 might be a good idea to put it into super. I'm not suggesting that we go into product choice, and whether it be a retail or a SMSF or whether it be any other type of fund. We just need to be able to talk about that basic concept of a tax-related service. And within that comes income streams and where the lines in the sand are between what's an accounting service in the ordinary course of business versus what should be a licensable activity is something we need to address, because there are too many people who have just left the industry, and they have just left because the limited licensing regime has been absolutely an absolute disaster. It was not good in the beginning. It's even worse when FASEA came in as an overlay and did not even consider that these guys spend less than 5% of their time working under a limited license. FASEA came in and said, as Tracey said, everybody's the same. And everybody who provides advice in this industry is not the same.
Bryan, you just wanted to touch on something there?
Yeah, look, I think what's important to remember as well in this sort of discussion about the, what needs to be done under an AFSL, what can be done by, appropriately qualified accountant, or even if it's other professions as well, outside of the AFSL. I think, though, particularly when we talked about financial advisors and the accountants and the differences here, when these rules were introduced, whatever it was, eight or so years ago now, the world certainly was different. We have seen a lot of changes. We've seen accountants have to come in. We've seen advisors have to come in under that Tax Practitioners Board perspective. We've seen accountants have to go to the AFSL side of things. Certainly on the financial advisor scene, we have definitely seen, an increase in the professionalism from where we were 8 years ago. Having a better understanding. I think same on the accountant side of things. We've seen, because of these changes, we've seen a better understanding come through. And it probably is that question right now, is that, do we need to go, not necessarily it's back to where things were, but is there a much better balance that we can have now? And I think it's right. As Bronny was saying, if you're an accountant talking with a client and you're talking about we've generated these profits, there surely has to be the ability to then say, well, there should be a discussion about some of your options as to what you can do with that. And yes, is some of that, get that into the superannuation regime. And then you work out how far do you go as an accountant, where do you hand it over to the advisor that's just going to specialise in that aspect. And I think, we're in a different space today to where we were 8 or so years ago. So I think there's real opportunities to explore how do we make this work better for the end client, but also for, the professionals that are providing advice to that client on different topics.
Yeah, and to your point there, Bryan, I think as well, and Tracey, I'll say this to you, you made the comment about the time frame of the past decade or so, how much accountants have improved, financial advisors have improved. I mean, the SMSF industry as a whole has gone ahead in leaps and bounds in that time period as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to build on the conversation, I think it just highlights just the various shades of grey that sit there for accountants and advisors in navigating this space. It's really challenging as to what falls into advice. And I think part of the problem that comes or stems from the fact that a lot of these provisions are built around advice being about products. So for the SMSF space, and we've seen a fundamental shift that really the focus for that is a lot of strategic advice. And I'm sure that is replicated many times over in other areas of financial advice. So this review really does give us an opportunity to tease that back.
And Michael, do you want to add anything there just around that recommendation from the TPP?
Yeah, two things. I mean, the key issue we have with the way the corporations law works is this inextricable link between product and advice. We need that's one of the key problems we have. So if we separate product and advice, that will solve a lot of our problems. But as far as that recommendation 7.2, we need to move away from the us and them for the accountant versus the financial planner sort of thing we've been doing for years. But we need to go back to first principles. It's about professional advisors providing the advice that's commensurate with their skills and ability, their knowledge and experience. And it's about getting those settings right. We should be able to have a framework where, irrespective of whether you're an accountant, a tax agent, an SMSF professional, or a financial planner, should be able to provide advice the same way, and the advice you provide depends on the skills you have and the experience you have. Yep. And if the framework works properly, it shouldn't matter. That's where we'd like to see this get to. The reality is getting there before the end of this year is slim, but if we can get on that path, then we've achieved something.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other areas, and Tracey, I might direct this to you, was being looked at is obviously the definition of a wholesale investor, and the current settings that are in play, and the fact that we haven't really seen any change to that for some period of time. So what's the view there in respect to the definition and ultimately its need to be updated?
Yeah, and I think there's a few parts to that. Firstly, the thresholds and the way that is assessed has been frozen in time, and it's not really reflective of where we sit today. So somebody could be a homeowner and not really have a lot of other assets and could be classed as a wholesale investor, but should they be betting the house on and taking the risk that they're taking? But from an SMSF perspective, we have concerns because there's various different interpretations out there. You'll see different articles and commentary from various different lawyers as to how SMSFs fit into that asset test component. So for our sector, we want to see greater clarity around how those rules are to apply to provide certainty. Concern is there for accountants that are signing off certificates. What risk are they carrying, given that divergent view that is out there? We've seen a large number of member inquiries coming through around whether clients will meet the test, how to apply the test in the SMSF context. And the worry is with the complexity in the advice space, that is there a trend to want to classify certain clients as wholesale to alleviate the compliance complexity and burden? When we look at things like the statement of advice is not required, no FSG, and it provides a carve out under the design and distribution and target market determination space as well. So the association would be very keen to see that have some really detailed review and reform.
Yep. So, Bronny, you want to add something then, Bryan?
Yeah, I'm backing Tracey completely. We're seeing more and more calls, queries come in, and they're not coming in from those who are licensed accountants. They're coming in from the accounting profession who's being asked to sign off on these certificates all the time. So therefore, it's not just our sector in the advice space, it's our sector that's got to sign off on it. So I wrote down just, a couple of points on this is the clarity of some of these definitions. We held a panel at an SMSF conference a couple of years ago, and on it we had some practitioners, and their definition of what constitutes, the definitions from QC is all different. So therefore that just shows that, if that's going to differ, how do practitioners put that into place? Not the family home Tracey spoke about, and I'm not completely convinced that wholesale investors are necessarily more investment savvy either. So the whole concept of a wholesale investor being investment savvy and therefore not having to have the same retail protections that Tracey mentioned with FSGs and statements of advice and all these other things in place, I'm not completely convinced that that's appropriate either. So I think there's quite a few issues within this area that need to be looked at.
So just because you're rich, you're not smart. I think that was the bit of the summary there, isn't it? So Bryan, over to you.
Yeah, so again, I think that's right. That's one of the fundamental pieces that, high net worth doesn't mean, you are financially literate. Because I think often you find a lot of very financially literate people who are not high net worth by definition. So you can never equate one with the other. Yep. I think there's a couple of really important points out of this. And one of them, again, I think is an issue that comes back to the responsibility of the advisor, the person providing that advice. So even if you are able to get an accountant certificate for a client, for a particular scenario, you still have to think about, is it right? So just because the accountant signed the certificate off for you, that's not for me, that should never be seen as a get out of jail free. I can now advise this client on a wholesale basis.
I think it is.
You have to think about, are they really someone who doesn't need that level of protection? So I think that's the first bit. The second bit to it, and I think this is the sort of comments that Bronny was making then as well, is maybe the part of the answer is let's find the right balance, because maybe you don't need to provide all of these different documents. Maybe some of these documents still need to be provided to a client or some levels of protection to the client, no matter whether they're wholesale or not. So yes, some concessions, but let's not give, exemptions from all formal documentation requirements that go to the client. Maybe there's some sort of middle ground. And I think the other piece, and this is the one that to me always comes up, particularly in the SMSF space, often where you're dealing with the complexity of the issues, then becomes to, which parts of the advice that I'm giving can I give on a wholesale basis, and which bits do I have to do retail? Because generally, if I'm talking about making a contribution to super, I still have to do that to the client on a retail basis. Yet I'm treating the client, because they're a trustee of a self-managed super fund, they're a wholesale client. So I've still out of that, I've got different interactions in different ways with the one client, depending on what I'm advising on. And that has to be confusing from the client's perspective as well. So not only about the definition, I think it's got to be thought about, what does that really mean? If a client's a wholesale client, they're a wholesale client. And therefore, why can't all advice to that client be provided through this methodology? And it's just really working out what that right methodology actually is.
Yes. Yep. And Michael, you just wanted to sort of throw your 5 cents in as well there? Yep.
Yeah, look, to reinforce Bryan's point, high net worth does not mean high financial literacy. Our advice to CPA Australia members who are asked to sign certificates is that they should still be using their professional judgment as to whether the client would be considered a sophisticated or wholesale investor, and if they don't believe they are, refuse the engagement. It's as simple as that. And the second point is, and as to Bronny's point, yes, we really need to consider what is the right balance of consumer protection. Sure, you're wholesale, sure, you're sophisticated, but still, what level of protection should they be afforded? Yep. If we can get the answer to that question right around wholesale versus retail and what level of protection, we probably don't need the delineation. If we can work out the right levels of consumer protection on what you're doing, the type of advice you're providing, you can start getting rid of definitions like this.
If we had simple documents to record or provide the advice themselves, well, then really it should just be a scope of works, and this is what we're going to do for you. And if the document's simple and clear enough and is easier and quicker to prepare, well, there shouldn't really need to be a massive difference between whether you provide a 78-page statement of advice or a 5-page one, because that differentiation should go. It should be based on what the consumer needs. and how they need to be protected. So there's got to be a halfway point there, or a middle ground somewhere, somehow.
We've touched on a lot of different topics and issues today, but just to wrap things up, I just wanted to ask each of you if there's any other key outcomes that you're hoping to see from the review specifically for the SMSF sector. Bronny, do you want to start?
I think we've covered off a lot of them. I think we need, going back to the first sentence that I gave, can we make consumer focused? Can we have decreased regulation? Can we have more affordable advice? And can we meet this advice gap somehow between a dwindling number of advisors and an increasing number of people requiring advice and needing good advice? And could we please respect the fact that the industry consists of a range of professionals, not just the traditional comprehensive financial planner?
And any final comments you wanted to make, Bryan?
Well, I think the first thing we obviously have to bear in mind that under the terms of reference for this review, they're not due to report back until the 16th of December. So it's a long way off before we're going to see, even if we see it on the 16th of December, we're lucky enough. Yeah. That was one of those Christmas 2022 presents coming out. Look, ultimately what you want to see is whatever those recommendations are, they are ones that can be actioned. And I think, ones that we can start to action as quickly as possible. I mean, if we're not going to see the final report till the end of this year, we're not going to see any movement on it until sometime in 2023 at the earliest. But what we want to see is things that are going to be, for the better, having that consumer focus and things that start to move in the right direction. The one bit for me, I think that is always important out of this, and I know the terms of reference also talk about increasing use of technology and so on, is really we just want to make sure that the reforms don't take us down a path too far where we start to dilute the actual value that the face-to-face, the personal interaction that the client has with their advisor is lost. Really, realistically, that is the most important part of the process, because technology is great, but we're not at that stage where it can interpret and understand everything. You need to still keep that human interaction with an advisor, and I just don't want to see that get diluted out of this process.
And you, Michael?
The important thing for us to remember that we have an election in the middle of all this as well. So,
who's presenting that in December will be very interesting.
We are talking about a December delivery date, but we're also got an election in the next couple of months, 2 or 3 months. We may see a change in government, we may not, but it may completely change the focus of this review and whether we actually see an outcome or not. So keep that in the back of your mind. For us, this review should have happened a long time ago. We've had a lot of reform coming out of the Royal Commission. We should have actually got our ducks in a row before we we initiated all these reforms. The government has done that. Now is a perfect opportunity to actually do the post-implementation review of these major reforms like single disciplinary body, the upcoming compensation scheme, and look what's worked, what hasn't. Have they met their policy intent? What are the unintended consequences, and how do we fix them?
And Michael, your point is excellent, but we also need to dovetail this with the law reform review, and also really the retirement income review as well. This is time to get it all lined up.
Yeah, Tracey?
Yeah, look, I think it's a real opportunity for advice to be modernised, to look at it through a new lens and to really look at what we can do for some really proactive, positive reform. Everyone's saying December seems so far away, but I think looking at the it's not really, when you look at what's on the terms of reference, and when we look at the work that's being done by this Australian Law Reform Commission, which is a 3-year timeline, and it just shows the high level of complexity. And I think for anybody who wants to go and look, we've had a fabulous webinar last year looking at the ecosystem, and just somehow they visually represent how all the pieces of the legislation work. I encourage people to go and find that on their website and have a look at it, and you'll understand why things are so challenging and so difficult. Hopefully we don't have a wallpapering over the cracks. We get something positive to come from this, but it shouldn't be the end of the story. I think the reform conversation and the review needs to continue beyond December so that we can actually look at getting some wholesale change and perhaps some new legislation that is far more functional, workable, starting with a clean sheet of paper so we can hopefully get it right.
Yep. And Tracey, even by December, you might be out of Australia as well. Who knows?
Well, we live in hope.
I think in wrapping up, I say on behalf of Miranda and I, a very special thank you to each of you. The one thing that really resonates with me is it provides a great opportunity as a profession, and I use profession in capturing everyone to actually help drive the outcomes that we want, rather than the shoe being on the other foot, which kind of feels like we've come from that direction. So I think Tracey you summed that up pretty well there, that we do want to, if we have this blank canvas in front of us to try and influence where we want to go, we want us driving it as a profession rather than it being the regulators trying to dictate the outcomes for what we see as being in the best interest of consumers. So Bronny, Tracey, Michael, Bryan, much appreciated for your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Cool.
everyone.
Thank you.
So it was great to have all these different experts and representatives from bodies and associations, and obviously Bryan from BT as well. What were some of the key takeaways you got from that discussion?
Yeah, for me, I think it's that real need to be at the heart of the consumer in everything that gets done. So we utilise now this consumer-centric framework, and that really comes through now in the design of everything that we want to achieve. So we want to ensure that we are providing everything that will be of benefit to an advisor. So of benefit to the consumer from whatever that advisor is, accountant, financial advisor, and so forth. So we're not getting caught up in 75-page documents, and that we're doing something that goes to the very heart of the issue that consumer wants resolved, whether it's to be able to make a contribution, to think about moving into a retirement income stream, whatever the case may be. And it will be very hard to do something with a blank canvas, but to the best extent possibly we could, I think it would be a great outcome to try and achieve that. But there's so much that we could have gone on with, and to give that 40 minutes was fantastic because we got some great diversity in views. Bryan obviously dealing with financial advisors for a long time and his area of expertise and so forth. He's obviously a board member at the SMSF Association now as well. And Tracey obviously in her role from a policy point of view, but with both Bronny and Michael representing a very large cohort of accounting members, you can clearly see a level of frustration in the framework that they've had to work through in the past few years, and ultimately led to some pretty poor outcomes, both from a professional standpoint, but ultimately for the consumer as well. So the need to fix this up and be and having that consumer at the very heart of it is going to be paramount to its success going forward.
Yeah, as you said, I think it's really important to focus on the consumer, and also that I think the different sort of parts of industry are all working together. That's probably the way that it's likely to get the best outcome. And likely to get a result from government.
Yeah, and to have, I can't remember who made the comment, but to have a unified approach. And what I mean by unified doesn't, and I think Michael might have mentioned this, it doesn't matter whether you're an accountant or a financial advisor or whatever. The reality is we want a consistent approach. And if the government sees a consistent approach in the outcomes that can be achieved, then we should be more driven by what the industry can provide, as long as it's showing that it is going to be in the best interest and outcomes of the consumer, rather than trying to fight and have this sort of internal politics around it and lobbying and so forth. And then it becomes a lot harder to try and find the position that is the right fit. And ultimately you end up with the problems that we're in today. So there is a real challenge for the industry, and I mean financial services in general, to try and work together as best as possible, because the more that we do see those outcomes being demonstrated, I think the better off the government is going to allow for the profession to try and drive what we see as best outcomes, rather than them trying to dictate it off the back of stories that we heard during Hayne and so forth as well. And that things like individual registration and so forth, I think will go a long way to creating a better and greater profession And when we look at SMSF, that's been something as a bit of a mandate that SMSF Association has been looking forward to bringing those members through to creating its own profession for a long period of time now.
Well, we'd like to thank everyone for listening in. And as usual, if you've got any suggestions for topics or speakers that you want to hear about, you can contact us at editor@smsfadvisoronline.com. And thanks again for joining us.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Look forward to you joining us for our SMSF Advisor Show. Take care and bye for now.
Interest rates are rising fast, and that means higher mortgage repayments. But some lenders have increased their rates more than others, so that could mean your clients are now paying too much for their loan. We can quickly compare your client's rate with hundreds of similar loans, so you are confident that you've got the best rate on the market, or we'll find you a better rate. Make sure your clients aren't paying the highest interest rates. Call Finny today. Visit finny.com.au and let us take the research and admin out of finding a new rate for your clients.